next step, now that we have our course line drawn between our departure airport and our destination, is to pick out some visual checkpoints to use along our route of flight. So the checkpoints that we're going to use, obviously they have to be identifiable from the air. So things such as towns, roads, crossing rivers, perhaps some lakes. Those would be good visual checkpoints that should be fairly easy to identify from the air. Now keep in mind that if this is a night cross-country flight, the checkpoints that you choose will obviously have to be lighted checkpoints, so things like towns, maybe some busy roads or lighted roads, but other things like smaller roads or rivers, lakes, that type of thing will not work very well for your night cross-country flight. So for our flight that we're planning, we're going to assume that it's going to be a day cross-country flight. So we can take a look at our route of flight here and start to pick out some good checkpoints that are easy to identify from the air. So the first checkpoint after we depart out of Brainerd, first checkpoint I would suggest should be within about 5 miles of your departure airport, and the reason for this is because you want to get a good start and make sure you're on course right away. If your first checkpoint was, let's say, 15 miles away, then you could be potentially flying off course for 15 miles before you'd actually know about it. So if your first checkpoint is relatively close, you can figure out very quickly whether you are on the correct course or not. So if we take our VFR plotter, so this VFR plotter I have on this side, you'll notice it says nautical miles, and on the other side you'll notice it says statute miles, which we'll come back to that a little bit later. So statute miles is not something that we're really going to use a whole lot for VFR cross-country planning. We're more concerned with the nautical miles. So for now, like I said, we want our first checkpoint usually about 5 miles away from our departure airport. So if we overlay our plotter on top here, and I'll zoom in a little bit to make it easier for you to see. There we go. So you can see here, there's if we adjust the focus on the camera a little bit, we're on the nautical side of the plotter, but there's two scales. There's a WAC scale and a sectional scale. WAC stands for World Aeronautical Chart, which is I guess more of a zoomed out version of the sectional chart. So we're looking for a sectional scale because we're using a sectional chart right now. So about 5 miles away from the airport is just outside the Class Echo airspace at the surface. Anywhere between 5 or 10 miles is probably a decent first checkpoint to have. So things that I'm looking for here, again, things that are easily identifiable, like power lines, roads, bodies of water, towns, that type of thing. So I notice right away that there is a lake just to the northwest of the airport. This is called North Long Lake. So we are going to fly right over the top of North Long Lake. I'm going to go ahead and set up a checkpoint right here on the eastern shore of North Long Lake. I'm going to call that my first checkpoint. So that checkpoint is about 3 to 4 miles away from Brainerd. So as soon as we depart from the airport, hopefully we'll turn on course and intercept that checkpoint right away. The next checkpoint, again, probably a reasonable distance away, maybe 10 miles, probably no greater than that from that first checkpoint, and that's because you want to ensure that your planning is accurate, because this checkpoint is the first checkpoint at which you'll start timing, and then the next checkpoint is where you'll be able to verify if you're planning the accuracy of your planning at that point in terms of time. So looks like there is another checkpoint that's probably a pretty good checkpoint to use. This looks like essentially a highway, which you can identify by the two lines running parallel to each other here. Then it looks like it goes north towards the town of Nisswa. So why don't we go ahead and select that as a checkpoint. So that's a pretty definite point. We're crossing over that road of Nisswa, or running south of Nisswa. So that checkpoint is almost exactly 5 miles away from our first checkpoint. Now, back to our first checkpoint, I forgot to mention that we are using a lake for our first checkpoint. Make sure that you use a definite point on that lake, so not just crossing the lake, because lakes tend to be quite large, and crossing the lake could be really any point along over top of the lake. So here my checkpoint is the eastern shore of that lake. It's a definite checkpoint. So our next one there is crossing the road, which is pretty definite. It doesn't take long to cross the road. So moving along, picking out some more checkpoints. These checkpoints can now be spaced a little further apart if we wish, so maybe 10 to 15 miles away. There's not a whole lot going on out here. We do have a line of longitude, but obviously that's not going to be visible. We've got a couple of roads that we're going to cross here, and then some roads that we're going to cross up there, but kind of in between those roads there's not a lot going on. So I would suggest perhaps our next checkpoint might be, I'm going to go with this road right here. Let's go ahead and make a mark there. So that road is almost where it comes to a T intersection with this other road. So hopefully that should be fairly easy for us to identify. And that is located 7 miles away from our second checkpoint. Next checkpoint, I think I'm going to use, there's another road up here, as well as some power lines. So if we go ahead and select that road as our next checkpoint, there's a small pond it looks like nearby. So another reference that you can use to help identify that checkpoint. That checkpoint is about 13, 14 miles away from our third checkpoint. Now we have to flip the chart to the other side to find our checkpoints over there. Okay, so here's our course line. Looks like it didn't quite transfer that part. There we go. So there's our course line that comes from the other side of the map there. So we're going to find some more checkpoints along that line. Looks like a good checkpoint. Our previous checkpoint is just to the south, right about here on the table. Kind of straighten that line a little bit, make that look a little bit better. So perhaps our next checkpoint looks like there's the town of Huntersville right here. And there's a road that runs north of Huntersville. So we'll say that when we cross that road, that's going to be our next checkpoint. Now to figure out the distance between those checkpoints, again we've got that road that we're crossing. Essentially our checkpoint was right about here. So if we kind of eyeball that a little bit, that looks to be about 10 miles between those two checkpoints. So that'd be a good checkpoint. Our next checkpoint, we're going to fly right over the top of Park Rapids Airport. So that could be an excellent checkpoint, especially for night VFR flight, because you can activate the airport lighting down there. For day flight, I'm going to go ahead, instead of using the airport, which is not necessarily a definite point unless you say flying over the center of the airport, I'm going to actually use this road that runs to the west of the town of Park Rapids. So it should be easy to find. It's just to the northwest of the airport and directly west of the city. So crossing that road is going to be my next checkpoint. That would put us about 10 or 11 miles between from the previous checkpoint there. So between Park Rapids and Mahnomen, there's not a whole lot out there. Looks like there's a road right here. There it is. That's just to the south of this long lake here, just to north of a private airfield Rooney. So that'll be probably our only option really for another checkpoint. That's about 16 or 17 miles away from our previous checkpoint. There's not a whole lot else that we could really use out there. Moving on up by Mahnomen. Let's see. There's a road that kind of goes around these lakes here. That might be a good checkpoint for us to use when we cross that road. We've got the lakes, the Twin Lakes nearby that we can help to identify that point. That's 10 miles, so about 11 or 12 miles away from our previous checkpoint. Next up by Mahnomen. I think my next checkpoint is probably going to be this main road right here that comes from the north out of Mahnomen, and there's also a railroad track that parallels that road as well, so we can use both of those to help identify that checkpoint. That's about 16 miles away from our previous checkpoint. Coming up towards Fertile, so I'm probably going to use I think the best option here would be to use the road that runs kind of just to the west of Fertile right there. Betra is actually an IFR checkpoint, so it's not something you'll be able to identify visually. But that's about where that checkpoint is located. So that looks to be about 18 miles away from that checkpoint. Now if we adjust the chart a little bit to look for more checkpoints, so our original checkpoints, or our previous checkpoint in Fertile is right here. Then as we come up towards Crookston, let's see, we don't want to get too far. That'll probably work. Why don't we use Highway 75? So Highway 75 comes from Crookston. So when we cross that Highway 75, I think that's a good checkpoint for us to use. There's a railroad track that parallels that as well to help us identify that point. And then our next checkpoint, now we're approaching Grand Forks, so that checkpoint is about 23 miles away from Grand Forks. If we overlay that, you can see right about there, about 23 miles away. So I'll probably need about one more checkpoint between there and Grand Forks, I would say. Now if we look around here, we could probably, we've got the small town of Mallory that runs along Highway 2, and there's some roads that go to the south there, so why don't we use that road. It's right next to a couple of towers as well, so it should be fairly easy to find. So that is 11 miles, or 12 miles between from our previous checkpoint, and then that's about 11 to 12 miles away from our destination, Grand Forks. So I think we've got all of our checkpoints laid out and marked on our sectional chart. So our next step is going to be to highlight our route that we have plotted on the chart, and the reason for this is to make it easy to identify this line in the aircraft. It might be hard to see when you're in the aircraft, so we'll zoom out a little bit on the camera, and we can go ahead and start highlighting that route. Trying to keep it as straight as possible. Kind of flip a little bit. Okay, so that takes us to the edge of the chart. Flip over to the other side, and we can of course continue that line on that side as well. Like so. So now our line should be much easier to identify in the aircraft versus just a pencil mark.
Next step will be to transfer the checkpoints that we have now marked on the sectional chart onto our navigation log.